Welcome to Muffin Talk.
Kia ora and welcome to Muffin Talk. This program is brought to you by the initiative Titipounamu, Study and Joy. My guest today is Dr. Joe Grayland. Now we've clarified what inculturation is. So why is it a dangerous concept?
Well, enculturation's dangerous. It's the question mark. If you bring in culture into Catholic worship, as we do today, what do you end up with? Do you end up with a blend of the Roman Rite with cultural things done? Do you just adapt certain areas? So, for instance, instead of saying the Our Father in English, we say it in Te Reo Māori or in another language. Do you just do those adaptations? Or do you try and go for an enculturated liturgy which says, okay, we need to change the entrance rites to the Mass. So we have the opening song, and then we have the liturgical greeting, and then we have the Kyrie, followed by the Gloria, followed by the opening prayer. Do we have to take all of that, set it to one side, and say, okay, let's do a porphyry, but not an adapted porphyry, but one that you would find on the marae, that is appropriate for people who are ordinarily going to that church. Which brings up the question, okay, when we then have visitors on that Sunday, do we deal with them as manuhiri? Do we welcome them in? Do we sit them in a particular part of the church? How do we deal with that? And so once you get into this deeper enculturation, then you begin to ask, is there a Roman rite? Is there a ritual here that is important? And so then you can get down into much deeper levels. And you could say, if you were in Japan, for instance, why do we celebrate the Eucharist with bread and wine when we don't have bread or wine? It's all imported. Can we use sake and rice cakes? Or if you're in Bavaria or in Germany, would it not be more authentic to celebrate the Eucharist with beer and pretzels? So you can see when you get deeper and deeper into the question of enculturation, you're actually getting deeper and deeper into the question of what is the church and how does the church live in a particular world, in a particular context.
That also means that you really have to understand liturgy, because you need to understand or tell the stories. Like when you talk about bread, for example, and you tell the story about Exodus, then the unleavened bread is really important. So you can't take pretzels because that's not unleavened. You would have to explain things, right?
Yeah, and exactly. And the thing is that the people in the story of Exodus have unleavened bread and they have wine. But the story of Exodus is bigger than the bread and wine. The story of the Exodus is the story of being moved from slavery to freedom through the waters of the Red Sea. So it's a baptismal motif. And it's really a motif that keeps telling people that you are in transitus, you are in transit, you are between. And so the tension is for us always to want to go back to the safety of our slavery rather than to live in the risk of being on the way to the promised land. So water is important, bread that's prepared so that you can rush off at a moment's notice, lamb, etc. All of these things, the herbs, they are all culturally clarified by the context out of which they come. The difficulty is that when you get to somewhere like Aotearoa, New Zealand, or if you get to Samoa, then you've got completely different ways of being fed. And you have different ways of assembling as a family. And you have different structures and understandings of how the land and the sea are used as key symbols, either of slavery or of freedom. And so this is the difficulty that when you get there, you can say, okay, we have to have unleavened bread and wine and bitter herbs. And somebody says, okay, that's fine. I'll go to the shop and buy them because that's not what we normally have. Or I'll get them imported. So again, when you're in the Pacific, you look at certain things and say, why are people using wine and not kava? And so when you get into these deeper questions, it impacts the liturgy because suddenly some people demand that the liturgy must change in order to be authentic in this place. And then other people will argue, no, the liturgy must absolutely remain the same so that the church across the world is united in one act of worship using exactly the same symbols.
And to me, the problem is also the explanation, because I had a conversation with a Samoan friend of mine some time ago, and we talked about our Lord's Prayer and that we talk about bread. And she said they use the word taro, but taro is a root. So you grow the root and you harvest the root. But with bread, I explained how it is really fruit of the earth and work of human hands. So it's not just a crop that you can harvest, but you harvest and then you work, etc. So it takes a while to have the bread. I think that it's so different, but without explanation, you don't know.
1975, Pope Paul VI issued his letter Evangelii Nuntiandi, and in that he said the whole way that we worship and the whole way that we are church can't just be a superficial coat of paint covering up what is deeper. So we can't ignore the local culture, but we can't at the same time sort of give up on the Roman culture, if you like.
Mhm.
So to evangelize human culture and cultures in a full and comprehensive way is actually to go down to the roots, which is the word radical.
Mhm.
So radical means return to the roots. But a radical return to the roots, when you have many different cultures, puts you into a place of competition, whether you like it or not. And so the question is, okay, if taro is going to be eaten and kava is going to be drunk, then how does the local Catholic Church deal with that? And then you have the conflict then within the local community when some will say, kava is the thing that makes people drunk, and it's a real problem, and we don't want to use it because it represents sinfulness or social inaction or a social problem. We will use wine because wine is the imported element. It doesn't have the local social connotations that are negative, and it has the spiritual things. So it's a sort of an elevated understanding. And so in all of this, you find that the culture and the cultures and the interpenetration of these cultures into one another is the thing that makes inculturation both difficult and in a particular sense, but not an absolute sense, makes it dangerous for the liturgy. But it's dangerous only in the sense of how do we authentically worship when we are aware of these challenges? So the word danger is provocative,
Mhm.
but it's not actually the most important thing. It's the word that simply alerts you to the fact that this is not simple. It's not a gloss, and if you approach it in that way, you will make mistakes.
But the other challenge, because we were talking about New Zealand mainly, the other challenge is New Zealand is so multicultural now that you'd have so many cultures. So you can say we do inculturation or we adapt to Maori way, but you have so many other cultures. You can adapt to, if you want to adapt to Maori and Samoan and Tongan and Filipino and Indian, and you want to do it all at the same time, that would be so
Yeah.
conflicting. What
Yes.
do you suggest to do then in order to make mass accessible for all and yet not give any specific cultural preference?
Wow, that is Yeah, and that's the question that many parishes faced. I know I faced that in the parishes where I was parish priest. So the reality in New Zealand is that we are moving away from a homogeneous, what you might call Irish or Pākehā, European, white, English-speaking church. So however you want to name it, with those characteristics, it's dying and has been for the last probably 30 or 40 years. And so a lot of the things that people are trying to do to resurrect parishes are really to resurrect this European clerical white Irish model, and they will all fail. However, how then do you integrate all of the different peoples who are arriving? One way is just to throw your hands in the air and say, let the Indians do their thing, let the Filipinos do their thing, let the white people do their thing, etc. Let the Pacifica do their thing, and we will just have a whole lot of communities that are all working individually in their own world, and they really don't have any relationship to each other, except for the one person is the bishop, and they name him in their Eucharistic prayer. And he's the point of unity, and everything else is just in a state of do it your own way. So compartmentalized, if you like, so that people are living in silos. So we have silo churches. It's one way to handle it. And it has its values in that you have here's the Tongan parish, and here's the Samoan parish, and here's the English speaking parish, and here's the Filipino parish, and here's the Kerala parish, and they just do their own thing. The silos can work as long as the bishop can manage that. That would mean that you'd have to have a bishop who's probably fluent in several languages, or at least comfortable in several cultures, so that he can represent all of those. Much more difficult because of the number of clergy, especially, but also dwindling numbers, is to try and bring all of those elements together in one Sunday Mass. And that's where you have to have a basis model. And that's where I would argue that the Roman Rite operates as a basis module. And it had a basis model. And in this model, it has certain modules or elements, and you look at each of them in turn. So you look at the entry rites, and you say to yourself, okay, we've got a whole lot of group of people. How do we bring them all together? Do we use one language consistently, or do we use a variety of languages in this period of time? For instance, is the welcome given in one or three languages? Is the Kyrie sung in Greek so that everybody shares it, or does it get sung in various languages on various weekends? And you look at that whole rite and you begin to say, what's essential in this entry rite, gathering rite? And you see that in the end, that the only things that are absolutely essential are the liturgical greeting and the opening prayer or the collect. Because when you look at other rituals, you can see that everything else in the middle goes, depending on what's happening. Then you look at the reading rite, and you understand that there are two elements here. There is reading and hearing. So, what is read? We stick with the scriptures of the day, nice and easy. How is it read? Maybe it's read in several languages, or there is on the PowerPoint, there is one language is used, and on the PowerPoint, there's a translation. But also in that moment, you have different ways of listening. So, for instance, in the Pacifica world, in the Maori world, the way to listen is to be seated on the ground, not to be seated in chairs, or to be seated around the walls, or to be lying, to be supine. So there are different ways in which people listen, and that also has to be taken into account. And then you come to something like the prayers of the faithful, and they're very easy, different prayers in different languages, different people reading. Then you come to the Eucharistic prayer, and I think this is where, in a place like New Zealand, you hold to the basis here. It's bread and wine because it is way too confusing and way too difficult to use other cultural elements. And so, what you've done really as you go through here is you just have adapted the liturgy in various places, but really not approached it in a fundamental way of fundamental change. So, the third element would be to sit down over a period of years, probably, working with specialists to build a New Zealand liturgy that is really quite different from the Roman Rite because it has very particular cultural elements in it. And then the question comes up, when you come to New Zealand, when you come from the Philippines or from India, do you have a fundamental right to bring that culture into the Maori local culture, or does the Maori local culture have a place of precedence in every celebration of the liturgy of the church? Again, answering your question is really difficult.
I think that you've given us a lot of food for thought. And thank you so much for raising these issues. And I know in my own parish we have the tradition of once every 2 months we have a multicultural mass where we all sing in the same languages, in different languages. So we have 7 different languages usually, and we all sing Tongan, we all sing Samoan, we all sing Tagalog, and we even sing German every now and then all together, even though I'm the only German.
That's good. And that's a great moment of adaptation. And so you can do that for many years, and it's very, very positive. But what has been enculturated there? Is it is the enculturation, the acceptance of difference, the thing that people are looking for? Or are they trying to use this as a process whereby the liturgy is reshaped to meet a local need?
I think it's
So
more
what
about inclusiveness. So everybody feels included in it, but it's not going deep to anything like enculturation.
Yeah. So again, it's really important. I think you've got to look at those real practical realities. So what I'm talking about is much more theoretical, but when you're on the ground, as I have experienced myself like you, is that the use of a variety of languages in a single Sunday Mass is about inclusion. It's about inclusion and accessibility. It's
Mhm.
also about training people who are there to be aware that the church in New Zealand is multifaceted and multilingual. And you've got to give room to people to bring their culture, their language, etc. in. And as you do that, when you're the previous dominant culture, like the white Irish English speaking people like myself, then you have to give space and room to the brothers and sisters who are coming from other countries and give space and room to their languages and their cultures. And to a certain extent, you have to say, okay, we're part of the past. The church that I was born in is dying in that sense that um, people like me and my younger members of my family, don't attend. The people who do attend are going to shape what's done. And there's a certain justice in that because they're the ones that are there and they are not the enemy. And so you can see in this whole thing of adaptation, inclusion, and welcome that you also have a low level form of adaptation and a low level form of enculturation. And the question is, of course, in the end, to what end do we do this? Because remember, everybody is being changed. So when people from the Philippines come and begin worshipping in a Irish Catholic white English speaking world, they feel left out until they are welcomed in. And so they bring a certain element or a language or a song, But then when it comes to something important for them, like Santo Nino, they may find no response. Or when people are coming from Kerala, bringing their language, they're bilingual, of course, as are the people from the Philippines. So they're bringing two languages, they're bringing ancient culture, and they're coming from much older churches than the New Zealand church or the Pacifica churches. So they bring ancient and venerable traditions. They can't be locked out, they have to be welcomed in. The difficulty is that most of these traditions are unknown to the Irish Catholic, English speaking white church. Then you've got another problem when you ask yourself, we're welcoming in all of these other people, but where are the local Māori? They've sort of been left on the side of the road, and have they been welcomed in the same way? And have they been given, and in this way I'm talking about te reo Māori, language, culture, etc., everything, have they been given a place at the table and an honourable place at the table? So
Mhm.
I'm sorry that doesn't make it any easier. These are the questions that I think people really need to ask themselves. And it's a lot harder to ask these questions than it is to simply say, let's sing the Our Father in Tongan today, or let's get five people up speaking the prayers of the faithful in five different languages. That's easy pickings.
Yes, it's a start, and but it's not the solution to everything. And of course,
Mm,
it also changes because as people are moving from parish to a parish, you might have a certain culture that is very connected to one parish, and then 10 years later they are in another parish. So there
yeah,
is also an adaptation there because once they are gone, then the other parish might adapt to their needs, and the first one might adapt to somebody else's needs. So I
yes.
think that this also shows that the church is moving, which is a nice sign that it's alive. Things are changing. It's alive.
That's right. And so enculturation is then that's a really good point maybe to end what I'm talking about is that uh, enculturation is there by the fact that people do it. And enculturation is not a static thing.
Mhm.
It doesn't exist once and then it's sorted. And that's one of the big problems that a lot of people have, theologians and conservative Catholics, etc., when they think the liturgy has never changed. And when they look at it, the liturgy has changed enormously since the Thursday evening when Jesus sat down with the men and the women in that upper room and said to them, here is the bread of life. Share it as my body. Here is my chalice of wine, my blood. You share it all with me. So in that way, he changed fundamentally the Jewish tradition of the Passover meal. Because at that meal, everybody had their own piece of bread and they had their own glass to drink from. But he changes it fundamentally. He says, drink and eat from this one reality.
Mhm.
Okay. So since then, the whole thing's changed. Languages have changed. The way that people worship have changed. The liturgy, who walks in, who walks out, who's ordained, who's not ordained, all of that sort of stuff has changed enormously. And it's only people who are ahistorical who get caught in the world of this is the one way in which it must be. The difficulty is that at the base of all of that change and adaptation, we still have to signal and symbolize the unity of the one body of Christ.
So we still have to go back to the roots and we still have to have the radical part.
Hmm.
Thank you so much, Joe. And I think this is definitely food for thought and it will evolve. And thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Out there, heroic peace is calling. In the bonds of love we meet. For the world, a new day dawning, and shines a light to greet. We're singing, this is the day when the hope was called. This is the day when the